Hi guys, Charles again. This is our fifth video in the series of videos dealing with chapter 3, and in this one we talk about equilibrium, excess demand and excess supply. However, I first want to go back to the supply curve. Specifically, I want to talk about shifts of the supply curve. So in the previous video we ended with talking about movements along the curve, and I neglected to discuss shifts of the supply curve. So I'll briefly just mention how that comes about. So let's say that there's a change in one of the factors other than price that influences supply. So in this case, I've circled technological change, or the state of technology. Now let's say that there's a positive development with regards to technology. Our tomato farmer learns about some new process, some new technique of growing tomatoes, and this lowers the costs of producing tomatoes. What we will observe in our graph is a shift in the supply curve in that case. So we shift from S over to S2. It's a rightward shift in the supply curve. And any change in that a change in any factor that influences supply in a positive way will result in a rightward shift of supply. Conversely, a change in any factor that influences supply in a negative way will result in a leftward shift of supply. One example of such a change might be an increase in the cost of the factors of production. So let's say that a new minimum wage is imposed by government on wages for farm workers. Our tomato producer then has to pay more to his workers. This results in a rise in costs and therefore lowers his profits. This will, in our analysis, will result in a leftward shift in the supply curve. So we'll move from S to S1 in such an instance. Okay, let's move on to the main topic of this video, equilibrium. What do we mean by equilibrium? Well, equilibrium is the status whereby the market participants, that is the buyers in the market, the sellers in the market, households and firms, are interacting in such a way that there's no incentives for either of these participants to change their behavior. Everyone, in essence, is content with the way that things are. In other words, the plans of suppliers and the plans of buyers coincide. Now this happens when demand intersects with supply. Graphically, we illustrate it as follows. So here you have a supply curve given by S, a demand curve given by S, and they intersect at point E over there at a price of 5 rands and a quantity demanded of 200 kilograms. So in the market, for whatever period this is being measured, price of tomatoes was, the equilibrating price of tomatoes was 5 rand per kilo, and the equilibrating quantity of tomatoes demanded in the market was 200 kilograms. Another way of saying this is that equilibrium occurs when the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. Now, if the price at which goods are being traded in the market is at some level other than the price that equates the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied, we say that the market is no longer in equilibrium. There is either an excess supply in the market or an excess demand. Continuing with our previous example, recall that the price at equilibrium was 5 rand and the quantity demanded at equilibrium was 200 kilograms of tomatoes. That is where the demand curve intersected with the supply curve. Now let's consider a case where the quantity demanded is larger than the quantity supplied. An example of this would be at a price of 2. Notice that when price is 2, the quantity demanded is given by 320. It's a low price. People demand more tomatoes at that price. However, suppliers are only willing to offer 50 kilograms at that price. Therefore, we have what we call a situation of excess demand. Higher quantity of tomatoes are being demanded than producers are willing to supply at the price of 2 rand. Next, let's consider a situation where the price exceeds the equilibrium price of 5 rand. So let's say we have a price of 7 rand per kilogram for tomatoes. Well, in this situation, we observe that the quantity demanded goes down to 120. However, the quantity supplied goes up to 300 kilograms of tomatoes. In this case, we have a situation of excess supply. Greater quantity of tomatoes are being supplied by producers than are being demanded by households. Now, that is not the end of the story. In fact, if the market is well functioning, meaning that prices are flexible, individuals or households and firms respond to incentives, we would expect the situation to change. In fact, we would expect the price and quantity to move towards the equilibrium level. So, for instance, if the price is at 2 rand, then we have a situation of excess demand. Households demand 320 kilograms of tomatoes at that price, whereas firms are only willing to supply 50 kilograms at a price of 2 rand. In such a situation, we would expect individuals or households to observe that producers will not be willing to supply the quantity that they demand, and they will start to bid up the price. And you might recall from our discussion of demand, when prices go up, we observe a movement along the demand curve. So as households bid up the price they are willing to pay for given quantities of tomatoes, we observe a movement up the demand curve in that direction. And of course, producers respond to this, as a higher price for their goods and services incent producers to produce more, to supply more. This then results in a movement along the supply curve. And this situation will continue until an equilibrium point is once again attained at a level of 5 rand and quantity demanded of 200 kilos. In the case of excess supplies, a similar process unfolds. So initially at a price of 7 rand, households demand 120 kilograms of tomatoes, whereas firms are eager to supply 300. In this case, firms will notice that households are not willing to pay 7 rand for 300 kilograms of tomatoes per kilo. And they will start lowering their prices, thus moving down along the supply curve. Of course, households respond to the price change and demand shifts down the demand curve, once again until an equilibrium price of 5 rand is reached with an equilibrium quantity of 200 kilograms. In this way, price is used to ensure that optimal market outcomes between those who demand goods and those who supply goods are obtained. We can think of prices as serving 2 different functions. Firstly, they serve a rationing function. Much like an auctioneer, they direct resources to where they are most highly valued. Secondly, they serve an allocative function, in that they signal to the factors of production where the best profit opportunities lie, or where the highest returns are. The last bullet on this slide just makes the point that markets are neutral to the ex ante and ex post distribution of resources.